Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars book review. This one is going to be Star Wars Queen's Peril, and this one is written by E.K. Johnston, who of course wrote the previous book to this one, which was Star Wars Queen's Shadow. So the way that this works is obviously this book came out like, what, a year or two ago, and this new book, Queen's Peril, is the prequel to this book. So that's an interesting one. It came out afterwards, but you know, it's actually the prequel. So you know, it fits for Star Wars, and it's an unusual way of doing things. So the basic idea of the premise of this book is that while Queen Shadow dealt with Padme during her transition from being the Queen of Naboo to being the Senator of Naboo, and you know, what the handmaidens were doing in their transition as well. We sort of had a sort of dual main character type thing going on with like Padme, of course, but also Sabe, the main handmaiden, the Keira Knightley handmaiden, being a sort of secondary main character in that book. And it was sort of surprising in that like it sort of accelerated very quickly through like Padme's death and stuff like that, and getting across the idea that Sabe's story, you know, is going to continue, which I believe it does in the comics. Some of the Darth Vader comics I do think feature Sabe and what goes on with her. I haven't read them yet, but I'm aware that she is in them, so that might be something I need to check out. So what does this one then deal with? It's obviously the prequel. It's dealing with Padme, of course, as the Queen. This one actually deals with the early days of Padme being elected as the Queen of Naboo. So it actually starts off with basically, you know, the election happening, her winning it, the transition of power from the previous queen over to Padme, and then of course the need to immediately establish Padme's security. So this is where we get Panaka actually being a somewhat focused upon character here, of him and his new idea to act as, you know, much better security for Padme. Is that like, okay, we'll reintroduce the sort of handmaiden type thing. Typically there's only one handmaiden. I think Padme helps him come up with the idea of like, what about multiple handmaidens? That way things can be more chaotic, there's more moving parts, you know, it'll be harder for people to keep track of, and it, you know, helps deal with our security. And that's what this book basically is about. It's actually formatted quite interestingly in the sense of, how do I show this? Yeah. I suppose like every fifth of the book or so, there's a page like this with a slightly different style font to the rest of the book. It's almost written like a diary post, and then it just has a sort of one-word title that is a sort of attribute of a person. So in this case, it's strength, and this is actually covered like basically within 2-3 pages how Panaka recruited one of the handmaidens to join Padme's security team. And so you get this as the book kind of progresses. Let me see, can I find one of the other ones? That is the Sabe one. And what's interesting in this one, of course, is that the first book revealed to us that all of those names for the other handmaidens, the reason they're so similar to Padme's name is because it's purposeful. When Padme becomes queen, she sort of has to leave her name behind, hence why she's Queen Amidala, despite that not actually being any part of her name. It's Padme Nabere, of course, is her actual name, but as queen, she has to become just Queen Amidala, leave the Padme behind, so all of her handmaidens also choose to leave their names behind and take on a name that references the name that Padme kind of had to leave. So that's why they all have the sort of E accent on the end. So it's revealed here that Sabe's actual name before becoming the handmaiden is, where is it here again? Yeah, Sabin, Tsabin. So of course they take the S-A-B, add in the E accent from Padme, and that's where Sabe comes from. And it's the same situation for all of the other handmaidens as they're introduced. So again, like I said, let me try and find one of the other ones where they go into this, where they reveal one of the other handmaidens. Yeah, here. This is another one. Cunning. So this is the Rabe. So her name is actually Rabine Tonsort, and so of course she just drops the latter part of her name as in the E accent. And the idea here is that Panaka doesn't just choose like girls that all look like Padme. That's of course the intent with Sabe, but it's also revealed that there's like a little bit more to it. He wants each of the members of Padme's handmaidens to have a specific skill set and represent something that, as the sort of inner circle of Padme's protectors, they can all add on to each other. So cunning for Rabe, because she sort of was doing some scams in school and she got into trouble, and Panaka became aware of that and is just like, that that is someone who could add in an extra layer of cunningness basically to Padme that she wouldn't have otherwise. That ability to sort of do some slightly more deceitful stuff more often. She'll learn some of that from Rabe. And of course then it's revealed that the other members of the handmaidens are like, okay, one of them is more of an engineer, of course, as we know. One of them is more of like a seamstress, and so on. And so each of them sort of represents this specific trait that is valuable to have within the sort of handmaiden group. And most of the book, especially the first 2/3 of the book, basically just deal with how do this group of teenage girls just interact with each other. Do they all get along, given that it's this very important thing to get right, to have Padme's kind of security perfectly, in addition to Padme, of course, having to adapt to being the queen. Queen Shadow, the first book, was a lot about how Padme has to transition from basically having that character that is the queen. Like the character of the queen is something that was constructed. It really isn't much of Padme's actual like personality. It's very much this constructed persona. Hence the accent that people have pointed out in the movie. That is the queen's voice. That was the best voice for like anyone who had to sort of fill in and take the place of the queen, a voice that they could all do rather than them each trying to sort of match each other's accents and so on. So it fills in a lot of nice little details like that, of like just, yeah, okay, that explains the sort of, you know, British, more sort of regal accent that we had, and then why Padme's voice is so different sort of otherwise when she's more natural after that in like in the second movie and the third movie and so on. And that was just kind of cool to see. And like, of course, the main one is, of course, that Sabe and Padme have to make sure that they are both, you know, really, really, you know, on par with each other, so that they can be, you know, perfect sort of clones almost of each other. Hence the whole plot point in The Phantom Menace, which does become a factor in this book, in that the last third of this book is basically a relatively quick summary of The Phantom Menace, but from the perspective of Padme, Sabe, and some of the other handmaidens. Again, it's super fast paced. Like, the whole book is sort of like that, of like, you're never on one scene for more than maybe 3-4 pages. And within each chapter, you're cutting from Padme perspective to, okay, we're over here with Sabe. Here's a Palpatine scene to just show that he's plotting in the background. Here's a scene with Darth Maul, very briefly. So there's stuff like that because we're getting to Phantom Menace. There's just very, very simple but effective and minor setup for Maul, just referencing some stuff that like wasn't really around during the Phantom Menace era back in like 1999, which was, of course, that he was from Dathomir and stuff like that. So that's now incorporated in much earlier in his story, and it works really nicely. Given that Palpatine Sidious, sorry, I got completely mixed up with all those names there for a second, but yeah, Sidious Palpatine has a few scenes from his perspective. Again, very small. It's mainly just getting across his manipulation of the Trade Federation, in addition to his political maneuverings to engineer the situation with all the bills and the trade discussions and stuff like that, to basically force Padme's hand eventually to have the vote of no confidence in Valorum, which would allow the perfect situation for Palpatine to be elected as the next Chancellor. So you get that whole situation. I was wondering from early on in the book if they would mention Plagueis, because to be fair, like the the prequel stuff to The Phantom Menace is probably best covered in a book like Darth Plagueis or Cloak of Deception, which go much more heavily into the politics, and then Darth Plagueis goes more heavily into sort of the machinations of Sidious and Plagueis to set up this whole event. Plagueis isn't mentioned, but at the same time, he's only covered so lightly that it's not really a thing where, like, oh, he wasn't actually alive at this point in time. They just don't touch on it, like, at all. Of course, they highlight the idea of that, okay, Maul is Sidious's apprentice, but there's no real suggestion of Plagueis either way. They just don't cover those scenes that sort of Darth Plagueis as a book does touch on a little bit. So that was something that I was kind of a little bit interested in, but it was kind of fun when it happened. Similarly, you know, when they're going through Phantom Menace and they get to stuff like going to Tatooine, they just quickly cover stuff with Anakin. Like, Anakin isn't really much of a focus, like, at all in the book. They just have, like, very, very brief cutaways. I'll see, can I try and find some of them to show you just how kind of small it is. I think I got a bit too far there. Yeah, it's just stuff like there's literally like a line. They cut to a new paragraph and it's like a line. Anakin saw an angel, just very quickly showing that, this is the point in the movie where Padme and Anakin meet, because they don't want to just go over scenes that we saw in the movie directly, and instead want to have scenes that we didn't see on screen but clearly happened during the movie. Of, like, you know, another scene of Padme when she's acting as the handmaiden, kind of scrubbing R2-D2, where she is kind of just talking to him and makes the decision to herself to be like, yes, I think I'll go and add to the list to try and make peace with the Gungans, highlighting her going to Boss Nass to ask for help to, you know, obviously fight against the Trade Federation invasion and so on. And then similarly, like, you do get like one or two like pages covering like Jar Jar, but it's very much just acknowledging that we're in Phantom Menace. Here's all of the key players, and we're just giving a little bit of insight that they're involved in this as it happens. Like, I suppose effectively, like, if you are reading this and maybe haven't seen the prequels, just highlighting that Jar Jar and I suppose Padme meeting Jar Jar was sort of key to her realizing that peace with the Gungans could have this whole extra factor, and if both species that live on Naboo can work together, a united Naboo can actually fight against the Trade Federation and so on. So it's stuff like that that works really well. Similarly, during the battle towards the end of the Phantom Menace, they just have some really small scenes just highlighting that, like, Anakin really liked flying, and then you get another paragraph focusing on more of the politics, and then Anakin really liked flying. It's just you know, weird, fun scenes like that. Like, that's how quickly at times it kind of does really just like fly through a lot of what's going on here. It's very, very fast paced as a book, and I think I appreciate that, because this was not a book that needed to get bogged down in like pages upon pages of descriptions and going in depth into the politics and stuff like that. This book, I think, works despite being somewhat, I suppose, maybe limited in scope a little bit, not being perhaps the most ambitious Star Wars book or most interesting Star Wars book. It works because they don't do more than they need to. It's about, 260 pages long, give or take it? No, 275, I guess. 275 pages long. It's about like 40 or so pages shorter than Queen's Shadow. And there's a lot of quick paragraphs, there's a lot of sort of, you know, pages that don't have a ton of dialogue on them and so on, so you get through the book pretty quickly. Like, I read this in about 2 hours, and even then I was going relatively slowly through it. So it's a quick read, but it's a fun read. In terms of a recommendation, like, it pretty much comes down to, did you read Queen's Shadow? Did you like Queen's Shadow? If you did, you will probably like Queen's Peril also. But it is very much dependent on, are you interested in covering more detail on Padme? Like sort of pre-episode 2 and 3 and stuff like that. If yes, you'll like the book. If you like the whole handmaiden stuff, Naboo politics, the fact that it is a little bit of a kind of different perspective on the Phantom Menace, being from the perspective of the handmaidens, you'll enjoy what's here. I'm not going to say that all those little references to like, oh, you get a scene here or there with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, or Sidious or Maul. They're not scenes that you need to really seek this book out for. It's just the sort of basic type thing that you'd expect. People are coming here because they're Padme fans. Maybe they're not particularly familiar with the full extent of Maul's story. It's just a little thing that informs you that Maul is from Dathomir. And here's some insight that the movie didn't quite give you into the character, but there's obviously been so much more content on Maul since then. If you weren't fully aware of the whole, how far did the manipulation go on Palpatine's side of things, with like the Neimoidians, this covers that without you having to read such heavy books like Cloak of Deception or Darth Plagueis, because again, it's basically a YA novel, or I suppose I'd place this as being sort of somewhere between sort of, middle school and YA sort of style, because it doesn't feel like there's enough depth that it's like full YA, like say The Rise of Kyoshi, the Avatar novel, but it also doesn't feel like it's so lacking in that it's basically just like a kid's book. It's definitely somewhere in the middle of just the pacing of it. When they choose to give detail, at times it's more like a YA, at times it's more simplistic, but it works, like I said, to get through it pretty nicely. So, I enjoyed it. I don't regret buying this or anything like that. I don't know how much room there is going forward for another one of these books. I think with these two, they've kind of covered most of the ground that they need to. Now, there of course is like a whole time period of like basically nearly all of Padme's reign as queen until her transition to being a senator. There's probably room for a story there if you wanted to, but it'd have to be something really, really good, and I'm not sure if they quite have that, because of course both of these books are sort of dependent on sort of the background to what's going on, of like, this is more based in sort of like, oh, we're setting up like basically Attack of the Clones style stuff. The Clone Wars is building up, and it's meant to link into all of like the Clone Wars episodes that deal with Padme and the politics. In this one, it's obviously more based on the previous movie, episode 1, and the setup for that. Whereas like just covering the big time gap between episode 1 and 2, how many big events are there that could really, get the attention? I could see maybe an even smaller book, like, a 150-page book about just a few incidents involving the handmaidens and Padme. There might be some value to a third book, but I think I think they've probably covered what they need to with these two. Like, I like E.K. Johnston as an author, and I'm interested to see what she's doing next. I think she was one of the authors involved in the High Republic project. Well, I don't know exactly if she's doing a book on it or not. I think we only know about the initial books of that series, so maybe she's on one of the later ones. We have to see what's kind of happening going forward. But yeah, we're in a kind of interesting spot right now with Star Wars, with like, obviously, okay, I guess we're a few months away from The Mandalorian Season 2. Clone Wars is over. We don't know what's next animation-wise, or really movie-wise, or other show-wise, because there's been like delays and not a lot of updates on other stuff. And then with the books, High Republic got delayed. It's not starting until January now. I'm not really sure why they did that necessarily, but okay. Other than that, there's like the new Thrawn trilogy, that's like a prequel trilogy, is starting, which should be interesting. But from what I could see on the list, a lot of the rest of this stuff is just your more sort of, fact file style books that come out kind of every year style, and not a lot else. Some short story collections. Not a lot of, novels or stuff like that announced until pretty much we hit the High Republic stuff, which I'm interested to see. Like I said before, I'm going to be checking out and reviewing the first novel in the High Republic. Light of the Jedi. I'm interested because to me this feels like this is probably a good step for Disney to actually finally now address a new era that we basically don't know about in novels. They have something to themselves. Hopefully they can get this right and make up for the failure of like the sequel era and so on by getting an era of Star Wars right. We'll see how they do. The writer looks good. I think the first chapter came out. IGN have it up. It seems decent so far in terms of like, oh, something's happening to the hyperspace lanes. What's the cause of this? We'll see what it's like in terms of the presentation of the Jedi, what this big earth-shattering event is that changes the dynamics, and I suppose primarily during this era, how much is going to be going on in the background with the Sith, because I think that's what a lot of people want to know about. And if they have a whole other villain kind of plan to be the kind of public villain, because of course the Sith don't come out until the Phantom Menace, you know, how interesting necessarily is this going to be? Because we're in that era of the Sith in hiding. We're in the middle ground between the prequel era and the Old Republic, which is, I think, what a lot of people wanted them to cover in the new canon, but they seem to have not committed to. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say in this video. But yeah, Queen's Peril, definitely an enjoyable book, but I think the recommendation is very much based on what you like in Star Wars. Like a lot of people with both of these books in a way. If you are not into sort of, you know, Padme's kind of early history, the politics of Naboo, the focus on the handmaidens, you're probably not going to be overly interested in what goes on here. There's nothing sort of earth-shattering in either of these books, but they're fun reads if you like a lot of that prequel era stuff. That's one of the main reasons why I was interested in getting both of these books, is because I kind of jump at any opportunity to have stuff that relates to the prequel era, which is my favorite era of Star Wars storytelling, because I think there are so many options with the span of time that you have here versus the, in my mind, relatively basic storytelling that you usually have to deal with during the original trilogy timeline. I think you just have more ground to cover with the immediate pre-prequel era. The Clone Wars is obviously an amazing time period to tell great stories with like the battles that you can have and so on. But yeah, they're my thoughts on Queen's Peril. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. If you've read the book or if you have any questions, let me know. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.